Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. And today I'm going to look at a little bit about the kind of the context of the Watergate scandal and the kind of political mood that was there within the kind of the American population as a whole. The kind of the level of attention that was actually being paid to the scandal. As it started to evolve, which is fairly minimal, and the kind of quite robust political fortunes of Richard Nixon. And the reason why I want to talk about this is because it kind of shows you how an example of how political scandals and crises kind of blow in seemingly out of nowhere, but have a long and gradual accumulation factor, a sort of a dialectic, if you will. And I'm reading from The Invisible Bridge by Rick Perlstein. Now, if you recall, anything that I'm reading about at the moment that you like the sound of and think might make a good Christmas present or you want to buy, if you go to the link I'm going to put in the bio, go to Storytellers Inc., a wonderful little independent bookshop, and quote Explaining History, they'll give you 10% off. So do make sure you use your independent bookshops, because you'll miss them when they're gone. Okay, but try that out anyway. So Rick Perlstein writes in The Invisible Bridge, which is a fantastic book, the story of the decline of Nixon and the rise of Reagan in the Republican Party. Presidents are always storytellers, purveyors of useful national mythologies, and surprisingly enough, Richard Nixon, this awkward man who didn't even really like people, had not been so bad at the duty, at least in the first 4 years of his presidency. At his inauguration, he promised to bring us together. Pundits swooned. A little more than 9 months earlier, he delivered one of the most politically successful addresses in the history of the presidency, the silent majority speech, which in a single evening increased the numbers of Americans who approved of his handling of the Vietnam War by 19 percentage points. In August 1971, at the lowest political ebb of his term, against a backdrop of some of the darkest economic portents since the Great Depression, he told a story about how he would protect the plain people from economic marauders menacing America from abroad, and sang out the dry economic details of Executive Order number 11615, providing for the stabilization of prices, rents, wages, and salaries, like a celestial chorus. Today we hear echoes of those voices preaching a gospel of doom and defeat. I say, let Americans reply. Our best days lie ahead. A pollster said of the approval that followed, I've never seen anything this unanimous unless it was Pearl Harbor. So after that, he had a diplomatic triumph in China, meeting Chairman Mao Zedong, and visited Moscow fairly soon after that, managing to initiate nuclear arms reduction talks, and appeared to be close to his endgame of withdrawing America from the Vietnam War. All in all, Nixon at that point is speaking a very attractive message to the American public. He is saying that the sort of things voters like to hear. Don't worry about the economic problems that are facing us, that are facing the rest of the industrialized world, of rising inflation and sluggish economic growth. We will come through it, because this is what America does. America overcomes these sorts of things. This is a very attractive message, and then he's demonstrating that the inertia of the Cold War can be shifted, and this virulently anti-communist leader can negotiate with the communists and protect America's interests. A grateful nation granted him re-election, writes Rick Perlstein, against the Democrat George McGovern, with 49 of the 50 states and a record 61% of the vote, including millions who had never voted Republican before, Southern good old boys, hard hat wearing union members and Jews. This was an election victory that was only rivaled by the 1964 election victory of Lyndon Johnson, the famous Johnson landslide. However, on June the 17th, 1972, 4 Cuban burglars were caught breaking into the Democratic headquarters at the Watergate office complex in Washington. Within 2 years, this triumph, this epic election victory of this strangely popular president, this peculiar, awkward man who was dislikable as a person, for the people that knew him, a very troubled, dour individual, alcoholic who brooded with anger and resentment towards others, who has managed to, for a brief period of time, kind of capture electoral lightning in a jar by learning kind of how to speak the language of what kind of ordinary middle and working class America are looking to hear. This man, within 2 years, this is all over because of what we're about to see emerging here. So 4 Cuban burglars are caught breaking into the Democratic headquarters at the Watergate officers complex in Washington. One of their accomplices, James McCord, had headed security for the president's re-election office. The Washington Post discovers that 2 accomplices, E. Howard Hunt, later the CIA, and G. Gordon Liddy of the FBI and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms, had worked in Nixon's White House and re-election campaign respectively. But the political damage was definitely neutralised. I'm not going to comment from the White House on the third-rate burglary attempt, the president's spokesman, Ron Ziegler, said, even as Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward of the Washington Post kept up a steady stream of scoops tying the conspirators to the Nixon re-election campaign, and reported that squads of dirty tricksters had circulated the country sabotaging the Democratic contenders' campaigns. It's interesting to compare Watergate with our current circumstances. I podcast here from the UK, and obviously we can look at the example of recently departed Trump's America, perhaps to reappear fairly in the next couple of years, ominously, and look at the power of the kind of the gathering Watergate scandal here. It would seem unlikely now that reports of dirty tricks and unhand behaviour would have anywhere near the same kind of impact. An awful lot of voters, and perhaps this is the legacy of Watergate and subsequent scandals, have in numerous advanced democracies priced this into the political decision making and made the broad assumption that kind of all politicians behave like this. Now, for our purposes, looking at the past, I think one thing we can draw from the Watergate scandal is that was not widely assumed. Is that a view of democracy in America, participatory democracy, was that whatever else comes or goes, political leaders do tell the truth. Political leaders don't behave in criminal ways. Political leaders are fairly honourable, and the odd one that isn't, well, you catch them out. And so initially the explanation that all this was a burglary, that kind of holds up, and most Americans sort of consumers of newspaper media particularly pay comparatively little attention. The Chicago Tribune did not run a front page story on Watergate until late August of 1972. A Watergate inquiry by the fiercely independent chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee, Wright Patman of Texas, could not win enough votes to go forward. Before the 1972 election, Gallup asked the public, which candidate, Mr. Nixon or Mr. McGovern, do you think is more sincere and believable? Nixon won 59% to 20%. Now, he wrote in his memoirs of his re-election landslide, I plan to give expression to the more conservative values and beliefs of the new majority throughout the country and use my power to put some teeth into my new American revolution. One reason why large numbers of people were willing to ignore this relatively trivial matter of this burglary, whatever it was about, is firstly the connection hadn't been made to the presidency, and it was possible to conclude, well, whatever's going on, it must just be a couple of sort of slightly rogue people in the White House, and Nixon will get rid of them. Also, Nixon is saying in 1972 something that's quite compelling to lots of Americans, something that is quite attractive, that after the kind of comparative chaos of the 1960s, where Nixon could look to the anti-war movement, the student movement, but particularly the rise of black activism, civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, which left many white Americans deeply troubled, even those that didn't like to overtly think of themselves as being racist, with this assumption that the country they knew, which is a white-dominated country, was somehow under attack. And Nixon used the idea of crime and law and order as a kind of a racist dog whistle, that he would be tough on crime, which was code for tough on black men. And this is really very a very potent mixture of ideas to people who describe themselves as being socially conservative, which are a large number of Americans, to restore America and restore the America that once was, this kind of mythical, imaginary America of the 40s and 50s, where people respected the flag and did their duty and all this other patriotic stuff. Here's this kind of conservative counter-revolution, which in many ways in America has been repeated again and again and again since Nixon. And it works electorally very effectively, and has really shifted the political landscape to the right relentlessly, with obviously all sorts of other kind of media collaborators and that sort of thing. But it emerges from the Nixon era. In the weeks before his re-inauguration, writes Rick Perlstein, during the Christmas season no less, he had risked international opprobrium by carpet bombing North Vietnam for almost a fortnight. He weathered the political storm. He was weathering all storms, and then, on January the 27th, 1973, he signed the Paris Peace Accords. The gross national product grew 8.7% in the first quarter. The Dow Jones was high. The Dow was high. Unemployment was low. Inflation predicted to fall below the previous year's 3.5%, and his economists told him with no worry about more inflation in the long term. At the news of advanced work for a summit in June with Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev at Camp David, a 23-year-old wrote to his hometown newspaper about how all his life it had been his duty to hate two things: Monday morning and communists. I'm no longer supposed to hate communists, and now I fear that Monday mornings are in jeopardy. Is nothing sacred anymore? In New York, a group of supporters began researching a constitutional amendment to allow Nixon to serve a third term. So it's important to kind of freeze frame this moment in the mind. This is as good as it gets for Nixon. December 1972, January 1973. It's if you were in the White House at the time, you would be thinking that, if only convention allowed Nixon to serve a third term, we would win hands down. This is a president who could go on and on. But within 12 months, everything has changed. And this is the interesting thing about the power of the Watergate scandal. Nixon, a man given to hubris, believed that he was politically untouchable, and he had all the kind of all the sort of the suspicions and paranoias that he kept with him, that festered within him, helped him to kind of create a mental map of the world where his downfall was eventually due to disloyalty and enemies and traitors and backstabbers and people out to get him, particularly the Washington Post. So Rick Perlstein writes, and so he took bold steps to remake Washington in his image. This is Nixon. Chief of Staff Bob Haldeman sent a curt letter to hundreds of presidential appointees demanding their resignations. They were replaced with more loyal men. Nixon announced a radical reorganization of the executive branch to give the new loyalists more power. He announced a Labour leader as his new Labour secretary, a historic first. That held out the promise of consummating one of his dearest dreams, to peel off the white working class from its historic attachment to the Democratic Party. I think we're going to keep them split, his consigliere on this project, Charles Colson, enthused. I'm awful bullish about what we can do in this country. The four burglars and their superior, Howard Hunt, pleaded guilty. The zealous G. Gordon Liddy refused to testify in the trial. Only James McCord appeared in the courtroom. The indictment was extraordinarily narrow, making the claims of Ted Kennedy or Woodward or Bernstein that this strange crime stood at the centre of a matrix of Nixonian corruption sound fantastical. The trial began days before the inauguration in the gilded ceremonial courtroom of John J. Sirica, an obscure federal judge whose badgering of witnesses about matters beyond his brief. Did they get any money to go in there? Was it purely for political espionage? What was the purpose? Made him look like a fool. For example, a handsome and smooth young treasurer in the Nixon campaign, Hugh Sloan, was asked about the time in the spring of 1972 he authorised his boss and even smoother deputy campaign manager named Jeb Stuart Magruder to pass over an enormous wad of cash. What was the purpose of the $199,000 to Liddy? I have no idea. You have no idea, the judge chuffed incredulously and started pressing even more intently. Why, he wondered, every time cross-examination led to the Nixon headquarters, or to questions regarding the hundreds of thousands of dollars of other investigations had already established had been laundered through Mexico before passing through the malefactor's hands, did memories grow vague. So the odds at the beginning of the Watergate scandal against Nixon didn't look good. The trial again at this point is not establishing the vast scope of the conspiracy. The Watergate conspiracy itself, I mean, Watergate's a bit of a problematic term because it focuses on the burglary, but often what appalled Americans was not just the burglary, but the wider set of conspiratorial behaviours, the actions of the committee to re-elect the president across America, seeding stories in newspapers, engaging in all sorts of dirty tricks to undermine the democratic process. Part of the fact of the Watergate scandal is that it is kind of one branch of a much wider kind of Nixon scandal, which was perhaps the product of Nixon's personality himself, Nixon's sort of suspicions and resentments, and his belief that he was under attack and so needed to be fighting a kind of a political war against his enemies, and I sense that this is at the heart of it. Now, it's not to say that you don't get other kind of mentally unwell, shall we say, or emotionally unwell characters in the White House. If you read about Lyndon Johnson, or John F. Kennedy, you don't find happy individuals. These are sort of morose, brooding characters. And there are all sorts of questions about the mafia and rigged ballots and all sorts of things with Kennedy's election in 1960. Something that Nixon was hugely resentful of when he has his feet put to the fire by Watergate investigators. He says, you've got to take into account how everybody else in Washington behaves. Timorous prosecutors, writes Rick Perlstein, did not follow the lead of Judge Sirica. On January the 29th, 1973, they closed their argument, noting that the defendants were often on an enterprise of their own, apparently at the sole instigation of Gordon Liddy. At a cocktail party, the judge was asked, only half-jokingly, if the McGovern people have hired you to try to reverse what happened in November. The jury convicted McCord after only 93 minutes of deliberation. Judge Sirica complained, "I am still not satisfied that all the pertinent facts that might be available, I say might be available, have been produced before an American jury." He set bond at $100,000, then he ran to the media to spread more imprecation. It got little coverage. The New York Times dismissed the judge's dignified clamour. On February the 7th, the Senate set up a special subcommittee under Senator Sam Ervin of North Carolina, not a nationally prominent name, to investigate 1972 Nixon campaign abuses. So here's where the scandal moves forward a little bit. There was a kind of a hope within the White House that with the first conviction, that might be the end to things, but apparently not. So in 1972, the campaign abuses of 1972 investigated. The resolution to establish it passed 77-0, and hardly would have been unanimous had anyone in Washington imagined that it would amount to much. So its unanimity doesn't suggest that there were thousands of, there were hundreds of American political figures in both houses who were baying for Nixon's blood and wanted him out. Its unanimity suggests that, well, sure, vote for it won't mean anything. In fact, actually, if it looks like you're addressing something but nothing comes of it, then that's probably a good thing. Senator Ervin himself considers it simply inconceivable that Nixon might have been involved. So again, this is a really interesting moment in American history, because it shows you the president that lots of people think exists is a very different character to the one that really exists. So as we look more at Nixon, and I want to continue with Rick Perlstein probably into next year now, what we're going to see is how rapidly and the kind of dynamics by which Nixon unravels. But the thing that doesn't unravel is this kind of right-wing counter-revolution that Nixon brings about. And the reason for that is perhaps got less to do with, Nixon as this brilliant political operator, and more to do with the fact that the ideas, the beliefs, the attitudes, the values existed within a significant number of American people and were there to be exploited. Politicians don't really create movements, they find them. This is my general view. It's probably somebody else's ideas, that. Okay, we're going to finish now. I just, guys, want you to know that when we get to 2022, it will be the 10th year of the Explaining History podcast. I'm quite amazed that this has been going for an entire decade. So we're going to be improving the podcast. There's an actual proper producer coming on board, so you won't be having to put up with my kind of scratchy lo-fi nonsense. And there'll be a kind of a few other changes. We're going to really try to sort of develop the format and grow what we do. Well, I guess what I'll say now is we've got a couple of podcasts left to go between now and the end of the year. But if you've been with me throughout that time, I'm hugely grateful. And if you just started listening, then it's gonna be an interesting ride next year. We'll keep doing the same stuff, and we'll keep talking about history. Anyway, have yourselves a great week, and remember, check out Storytellers. They will give you 10% off any book I talk about on here that you're interested in, and cite Explaining History to get your discount. Thanks very much. All the best. Take good care. Bye bye.